Welcome to Mutual Exchange Radio, a project of the Center for a Stateless Society. I am your host, Zachary Woodman. Today's guest for the third time on MER is Kevin Carson. Kevin probably needs no introduction, but he is a senior fellow at the Center for a Stateless Society and holds the Center's Carl Hess Chair in Social Theory. He is an anarchist without adjectives, heavily influenced by autonomism and the new municipalist movements. His written work includes studies in mutualist political economy, organization theory, a libertarian perspective, the homebrew industrial revolution, a low overhead manifesto, and the desktop regulatory state, all of which are freely available online. Carson has also written for such print publications as The Freeman, Ideas on Liberty, and a variety of internet-based journals and blogs, including Just Things, The Art of the Possible, as well as his own blogs, The Mutualist Blog, and Tea Earl Grey Hot. Today, Kevin is on to discuss his 2021 study on the Methodenstreit between economists of the Austrian school, such as Karl Menger, and economists of the German historical school, such as Gustav Schmaler. We discuss Carson's view on methodology of the social sciences in general and political economy in particular, as well as his views on interest, landlordism, and the American institutionalist school. Without further ado, here is Kevin Carson. Hello, this is Zachary Woodman. You're listening to Mutual Exchange Radio. I am joined today by Kevin Carson. Kevin, how are you?
Great. How are you?
I'm doing good. So a couple years ago, you had released this interesting study that was in some ways a return to your earlier work on political economy on the Methodenstreit. So let's start with just like a basic overview for the listeners. What exactly was at stake between Austrian marginalists like Menger and German historicists like Schmaler during the Methodenstreit?
Well, the historicists argued that there was the idea of universal transhistorical economic laws came with a lot more qualifications from one historical era or social system to the next, just depending on their institutional structure, than the Austrians did. I don't think they were total historicists in the sense of arguing that there were no transhistorical laws, but they put a lot more emphasis on institutional differences from one historical era to the other, and the qualifications they put on the application of economic laws. And Austrians like Menger reacted negatively to that and argued more for the existence of objective economic laws that remained universal from one historic era to the next.
All right, so let's give an example. Like, what would a law that the historicists would have said was completely institutionally or historically contingent? What's an example of one that historicists would have disagreed had universal applicability, whereas the Austrians would have said it did?
Well, just to take something really basic, the law of supply and demand. I think the historical school would argue that the law of supply and demand always holds true as such, but the supply and demand themselves, it holds true as such in the sense that the relationship between the quantity supplied and quantity demanded at any given time determines the price, but it's conditional in the sense that the supply and demand themselves are dependent variables that are affected by the institutions that control the quantity supplied and quantity demanded.
So basically the claim is that the resources and subjective attitudes that are contained there in the supply and demand curve are treated as endogenous to the model by historicists, whereas they're treated as completely exogenous by the Austrians in a certain way?
Yeah.
All right.
Especially things like property rules on land.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's get into like your position between the two. It's commonly argued by contemporary Austrians that the historicists basically completely lost the Methodenstreit, whereas you seem to have a bit more of a qualified or nuanced take on what was at stake in those debates and who actually sort of like wound up incorporating the insights from who. What do you take out of the historicists and the Austrians in the debate? What do you take were the positive insights the historicists gave versus the Austrians?
Well, actually, I probably rely a lot more on the institutionalists.
The Americans.
Yeah, Veblen and Commons.
Mm-hmm.
I used the Methodenstreit as a jumping off place for introducing the whole debate, but I really rely more on the institutionalists just for my critique of the Austrians and of marginalism in general.
So what do you take the insight from the American institutionalists like Veblen and Commons were?
That, what I said before about laws, supposedly objective laws like supply and demand being objectively true, but only in a relatively trivial or obvious sense compared to institutional forces that determine what supply and demand are in the first place.
Mm-hmm. And what are those institutional forces that you think are particularly important that the marginalists, whether in Austrian or neoclassical flavors, tend to exogenize?
Well, things like the structure of property rules, probably most importantly, property in land and property and residual claimancy of the firm or control over firm governance.
So property over land, property over like ideas, intellectual ideas. So, I mean, is it fair to say...
Yeah, that's another big one.
Is it fair to say that a lot of this sort of, I don't want to say paradigmatic, but disagreement over which research program we adopt has to do with like a difference in what you take to be normatively relevant or the relationship between your sort of normative values and the economic theory? Because like from what the Austrians consistently emphasize is that what they are doing is in some sense Wert-free, right? That they are taking these institutional constraints as exogenous because they view this as like a methodological bracketing procedure for understanding the institutions of historical capitalism or whatever before critiquing them. Whereas you seem to say, well, if you exogenize everything, you've made it normatively irrelevant in a certain way. How do you view as the relationship between normative or moral priors and economic analysis in the way you approach political economy versus the Austrians?
Well, before we even get into the normative aspect of it, I would say that bracketing out all historical and institutional considerations makes it descriptively irrelevant. You've got a set of laws so general that they're useless for any practical purpose in analyzing the functioning of a specific historical context. You would have to take into account all the issues that the marginalists abstract out, even to get a a useful empirical description of reality. And to a large extent, marginalism, I think, deliberately abstracts out a lot of the institutional consideration that people like Ricardo and other classical political economists analyzed from the standpoint of, issues of factor ownership and their effect on economic outcomes. The general tendency of marginalist economics is to abstract out all institutional and power considerations and redefine everything in terms of neutral laws of exchange.
So your take then is that everybody seems to be engaging in some level of abstraction. The question is, what do they abstract out versus what do they not abstract out? So let's just take, for an example, some of the shortcomings that I think you and I would agree were shortcomings of both the historicists and the American institutionalists. Someone like Veblen is going to wind up wanting to make like biological and anthropological things considerations also subject to analysis and control by the economists. This is why he winds up defending things like eugenics, right? The way I see these historical debates is that they're not just the Austrians and marginalists more generally are not just trying to resist the creep of normative analysis into theory or just trying to defend existing capital relations, although there's a fair bit of that going on. But they're also trying to resist this sort of like what Mises called polylogism, or what the sort of like nationalist character economics that someone like Friedrich List would have defended. How exactly do we include what is normatively relevant, or include the institutional and historical context in our economic theorizing without it collapsing into that sort of parochialism?
Well, I mean, if applicability in the sense of a fine-tuned understanding of particular sets of circumstances is parochialism, I guess it's just a necessary evil. If you have such a level of abstraction that you have rules that don't really tell you anything without the consideration of specific institutional contexts, what good is it? The way I frame it is the classical political economists did a good job in framing the questions, in framing the role of institutional relations, and in making generalizations about economic phenomena. And marginalism, potentially just through mechanisms like von Bauwerk's marginal pairs of buyers and sellers, and the effect over time of disappointed sellers or disappointed buyers and shifting supply and demand and so forth, that potentially offered a mechanism for describing how the classical political economists' generalizations worked. But instead, the marginalists seized on these theoretical innovations as a way to completely ignore the classicals' generalizations and sweep them under the rug so that they wouldn't have to be considered. And essentially just made themselves irrelevant to any kind of critical analysis. The only way to make the marginalist analysis applicable in a practical sense is if you treat the current institutional structure and the existing economic system as just something neutral and inevitable, and then analyze how the laws of supply and demand function within it. And in so doing, you've pretty much just removed yourself from any kind of comparative historical critical analysis of how the present system differs from previous historical systems and the institutional changes that brought it about.
So, is it fair to say then your critique of the neoclassicals and the Austrians, again, marginalists of any sort, is not that they don't have the resources, the theoretical resources, to make these sort of institutional critiques that we see in Ricardo and Smith and George and people like that? It's just that they suppress those theoretical resources in pursuit of a sort of value neutrality that isn't even there in their work to begin with.
Yeah. It's not really value neutral. The values are built into the analytical approach from the outset. The marginalist approach, as I put it before, sweeps institutional considerations under the rug and hides them under the appearance of purely exchange relations.
Because
they just become problems of price formation.
Yeah, it seems to me like if I were a neoclassical trying to do institutional criticism, what I would do is I would build a mathematical model of labor relationship, of labor market. This is just an example. Build a mathematical game theoretic model of labor negotiation, which neoclassicals have done. Point out how the outcomes of this labor negotiation are all dependent on the bargaining power of the employer and employee in it. And then point out how that bargaining power has been systemically molded in the employer's favor instead of the labor's favor. And then almost all the sort of socialist criticisms fall out of that. It seems to me like the resources are there for the neoclassicals to do that, right?
Yeah, I think that's on the right track there. The example I would give is Clark's marginal productivity theory, which argues that the returns to each factor are determined by its marginal productivity. But that's a classic example of how institutional considerations are read out of the analysis, because the whole concept of marginal productivity is circular in a lot of ways. It's just a way of restating bargaining power, because the marginal productivity of a factor is whatever it adds to the final cost of or the final returns on a good or service, and that depends on what the factor owner is able to charge. So,
it pretends to treat bargaining.
I'm sorry. The marginal productivity of labor in a situation where the land was never enclosed and workers were able to enter the labor market on their own terms, or a system where under the terms of business law, laborers are automatically the residual claimants who hire capital. Under those circumstances, the marginal productivity of labor would be vastly different from the system we have now, where the wage labor market was created by enclosure, and the standard business model is for providers of capital to own the shares in the business.
Yeah, you bring up like the residual claimant stuff. Like, it seems to me like Austrians also have the resources to make these sort of critiques within their own research program. Um, like, there's this paper, I think I sent it to you a while back, by Peter Leeson about how privatization can destroy wealth in developmental economic contexts where the people who make the decision to privatize are not themselves residual claimants to the act,
Yeah.
right? Um, and Leeson is one of the Austrians that really kind of like walks the line between being neoclassical and Austrian in a lot of ways. But what seems to me like is that like every single one of these paradigms, progressive research programs, however you want to understand them, have the resources to make these sorts of critiques. They just often don't. So the question then becomes, why don't they, from your perspective?
Yeah, and I think it was to a certain extent a political decision. I mean, at least in the case of Jevons, I think he was on some level consciously aiming primarily at creating a new paradigm that would render Ricardian economics irrelevant just because of the political uses that it had been put into by the Ricardian socialists and Marx. There's some ulterior motive just in the parts of the intellectual toolkit that have been discarded. Another example would be the Ricardian and Georgist analysis of land rent, which all of those theoretical insights, which are, as far as I'm concerned, indispensable to any kind of useful analysis of land in the current economy, those were deliberately thrown out by subsuming land as just another form of capital without taking into account its unique characteristics.
Yeah, and that point, like, one of the main theoretical sticking points between Austrians and neoclassicals is in capital theory, where Austrians say with the Georgists that you can't just aggregate all of capital into one homogeneous pool and then treat it all as one sort of thing, because capital is necessarily heterogeneous, can't be completely, it's not completely fungible between different uses, right? Um, like, it seems like the Austrian would still question as to why a land is treated as something so distinct that it's not capital at all. But they would definitely be on board with the general criticism that, alongside a lot of the post Keynesians, for that matter, in the Cambridge Capital controversy, right? They would say there's something wrong with treating capital as one homogeneous good. They're just questioning why land is treated so separate. So why, from your perspective, does it seem like land should still be treated as something so unique that it's not remotely capital to begin with?
Well, capital is something that can be created to an extent that's largely elastic by human labor acting on natural resources. Its supply can be increased in response to increased demand, whereas land, in the Georgist sense of locations, its supply cannot be increased by any amount of human labor. Or in the Georgist sense, you can apply labor to land to make it more usable. But those improvements to the land and buildings are a reflection of the law of rent and operation. The more labor and capital that have to be applied to land in order to make it as usable as the intramarginal land amount to a form of rent accruing to the old intermarginal land that doesn't require as much labor and capital to make it functional. So I've heard Austrians argue that land is reproducible because of things like ocean platforms or multi-story buildings, but they're actually arguing at cross purposes with Georgians, Georgists, because a Georgist would say the amount of extra effort you have to put into building a multi-story building, and the amount raises the cost per square foot of a given amount of floor space on that particular land location compared to the cost on a piece of land that's been developed without those multi-story buildings. So yeah, the amount of labor that you have to apply to a given unit of land to create a certain amount of usable space on it amounts to a rent that accrues to people who don't have to apply that same amount of labor.
So the idea is...
And exactly, well, and in exactly the same way that Ricardo would say that the more money you have to spend rendering a piece of land, a marginal land, fertile, amounts to that much more unearned rent accruing to someone whose land was already fertile, that was appropriated earlier.
So is the idea that basically the Austrians and Georgists are talking past each other, whereas the Georgists are conceiving of land rents as just like a function of their location, whereas the Austrians are treating that as kind of endogenous?
Yeah, and I think the Austrians are ignoring a consideration or discarding it that is relevant to understanding the situation. They're making it making economic science, their analysis, less perceptive and less useful for describing a reality just for the sake of theoretical elegance.
But is it really just for the sake of theoretical elegance? Because, it seems like the Austrian can, at the level of theory, say, yeah, we can distinguish between a land's value just based off of the value it gets from being where it is, its location, or maybe, its natural properties, like whether it's a swamp or already a field or something like that, and the value that is contributed by laboring on the land to make it useful for some purpose. But in practice, this is where the Austrian has a huge but, right? In practice, being able to distinguish between the value that simply comes from its location and the value that comes from labor is so difficult to tease apart, because that value is also kind of subjective in a very deep sense, that there's not much that we can do with that information when we use it to frame policy or something like that.
Well, I mean, in areas that have actually implemented land value taxation or that tax land value at a different rate from buildings and improvement, they've had quite a bit of practical success with economic benefits.
Can you say more about that empirical evidence that economic benefits have come from imputing land value taxation?
Well, just in practical terms, when you tax land location at a higher value than buildings and improvement, or if you shift property tax entirely off of buildings and improvement and solely onto the land value, you're encouraging building and improvements, and at the same time you are you're raising the cost to real estate speculators of holding undeveloped land out of use. So when you do that kind of tax shift so that the tax on undeveloped land is proportionally higher, you're creating an incentive for speculators to dump that land on the market because it's less profitable to hold it out of use. So you wind up not only with increased building and construction booms, but you wind up with compact infill development of vacant lots inside of cities with all sorts of positive effects on the cost of the transportation system and public utilities, this decline in sprawl and in pathological effects of car culture and so forth. In the areas where they've tried differential taxation, that's been the actual effect of it. It's lowered housing costs and it's increased employment via the construction industry.
All right, so it seems like then one of the key differences here is you write from the paper, and in this you're critiquing Karl Polanyi, quote, "It is impossible by definition to conceive of a purely free market, that is, because markets only operate within the interstices of a system characterized by a certain distribution of property and set of property rules, i.e. the rules governing initial acquisition, transfer, alienation, and abandonment of land, residual claimancy and governance rights in the firm, property and intangibles, etc., which, rather than resulting from the market, are logically prior to it." What do you mean by logically prior there? Because from like a more Hayek side of the Austrian school perspective, property norms aren't really prior in that strong way because they view property as kind of constantly in this evolving state of evolution within a market order that is being like negotiated and respecified through like common law arrangements and like legislation, democratic legislation imposed from without for Hayek. Right? It seems like what an Austrian of the contemporary, more Hayekian sort is going to say is that property itself is kind of internal to the market process as agents engage in quotient bargaining or sort of informal and formal norms of commons pool resource management that like someone like Ostrom would write about emerges, and it's not completely logically prior to the market process.
Yeah. Well, I would say it's logically prior, but not temporally prior. It's logically prior in the sense that there is no particular, obviously, free market form of property ownership that can be logically deduced from self-ownership in the sense that you could say only non-proviso lock-in property is legitimate free market property or whatever. The choice of the property rules is itself logically prior to the market, and the market itself, what I'm referring to is just the price formation process of creating market clearing prices without any external hindrance. That you can have an unhindered market clearing price formation process that's consistent with any number of particular sets of property rules. And even when you change the system of property rules within a given market, I think you're doing something that is logically prior to the price formation process. You're making institutional changes that are themselves just foundational to the society. They're either legislative and or constitutional changes in the way the institutional structure is regulated, or they're set up as a fundamental or constitutional foundation of the system from the beginning. But either way, even if they're changed over time, that's a process that is logically prior to the operation of the price mechanism. When you change the property rules, you immediately change the way the market price formation system functions within that institutional framework.
I guess
it's not something that can just be changed through the market itself.
But so one of the moves that the more radical of these Austrians make is to try to make it endogenous to the operation of the market itself through things like polycentric legal mechanisms, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, isn't that move specifically to try to make it so that, the market process settles on better and better norms given the facts on the ground in a certain way?
Well, it sounds like you're describing something along the lines of anarchy state and utopia with the
something more along the line.
Polycentric.
So something more. I mean, the third section of the Utopia of Utopias can be read as a sort of anarchism, right? That's what people like Kukathis do with it. I'm more thinking about something more David Friedman's move, right? There's a lot of Austrians, people like Horwitz, Betke, all the Lavoie children, who take that polycentric way of approaching legal orders to make it so that the property norms are themselves responsive to the evolution of the market process, right?
Okay. I'm not sure of the practicalities of that. I think you would have to still have some sort of meta system with a larger set of property rules governing what was possible within the local enclaves and how the rules were determined within that set of enclaves.
That meta system being
I'm not sure how that would work out. I think at some point you've got to have a fundamental agreement just as the starting point over a contiguous geographical area for the system to work. And from that point on, you've got to have some kind of a fundamental agreement on how the property system is changed.
So you're claiming...
I see arguments. I see arguments from ANCAPs saying things like voluntary socialism is fine if people want to pool their property and create a communal system, but the implication there is that they have to meet the Lockean standards of acquiring the land in the first place by buying it or receiving it as donations from the capitalist owners before they can set up those communal bylaws on the land that they've acquired in that manner within the confines of a larger system operating according to the rules of that larger system, larger Lockean system.
So if you're
talking about multiple geographical areas that have differing fundamental property rules systems, that's one thing. I'm arguing that a particular set of rules is more desirable in as many locations as possible. But I understand that in a transitional period, there would be coexisting sets of different rules in different geographical areas, just depending on what movement was in power.
So it seems
or
like
a convincing majority.
it seems like you're saying the mistake made when ANCAPs make that move is that they kind of are abstracting away the process of institutional selection from the sort of path dependency that it's going to take, given who has bargaining power within that legal system to begin with. Is that a fair, brief way of putting it?
I think so, although we're kind of getting out into the weeds here. It's been a long time since I wrote this paper or any kind of, in-depth analysis of property rules systems. But I think if you allow the competition of property rule systems within a given area, if you're going for something like Friedman's approach of having a polyarchic enforcement system where the different coexisting systems in the same area have different property rules and they're competing with each other, I think you probably wind up with one of them winning out or becoming predominant and leading to a single system of rules that are maybe hierarchically bracketed within each other, but according to a consistent system of meta rules. But I think in most cases, without exogenous funding of enforcement on the general taxpayer, the cost of enforcing control over a given tract of land and excluding squatters would exceed the economic value to the holder if they had to maintain control of it themselves. I think just the efforts of squatters would wind up making, and rent strikes and so forth would wind up making most private capitalist landholding economically unprofitable if it weren't for the state.
So your claim is that we should not be completely neutral on which property norms emerge from that process. And we can't be neutral given that certain norms are likely to be sticky, given that we're starting from a place of those norms being quite normatively objectionable. Does that sound right?
I'm not sure. I'm just arguing just from an empirical or descriptive standpoint that absentee ownership is unlikely to prevail in most cases where there is no state-funded enforcement mechanism that's paid for by anyone but the owners themselves, and that it will become more costly in areas where anti-landlord sentiment prevails, which to me is just basically any area where there's a triumph of classical anarchist or libertarian socialist ideas.
Okay, so you're also so that seems to me where you're saying the neutrality shouldn't hold, which is that we should work to change the preferences of the people within these systems such that they are more skeptical of things like absentee landlordship or intellectual property,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I'm wearing two different hats. I'm when I describe the practical descriptive problems with neoclassical or marginalist economics, I'm wearing one hat, and when I argue that we should be promoting opposition to absentee landlordism, I'm wearing my ideological hat. But I think you can do one without the other.
Yeah. So let's get into the ideological hat case against absentee landlordism a bit, as you see it.
Well, I mean, it just goes back to I guess it's derived from the same basic factual observations that Henry George and anti-landlord theorists like J.K. Ingalls and Benjamin Tucker started from, with the fact that land is an uncreated good that there is a limited supply of, and no one should be able to fence it off and hold it out of use or continue to or charge tribute to the people who actually develop it, or that they should be able to maintain ownership of something that they're no longer using, for the same reason that you should no longer be able to walk into a theater and definitely save a seat for someone. You're entitled to the product of your own labor, but you are not entitled to unearned income from sitting on the land itself, the location that you didn't create. It should be treated from the outset as the land itself, the locations, and the finite resources like minerals and so forth should be treated as a socially owned commons rather than as a privately appropriated good.
All right. What of the other case that you are fighting against, which is intellectual property? You're also wearing two hats with that one, right?
Yeah. I've got the hat that just describes the economic effects of it, which I think most people would agree are deleterious. And I'm wearing the hat that says it's unjust.
So what would stop something like IP from re-arising in an anarchistic context? Because it seems like one area where IP came from, other than just the pure rent-seeking one, is the problem of stopping fraud, right? I make a bottle that looks like Coca-Cola, but I put something poisonous in it, right? And the sort of normative case that libertarians make is to say, well, the wrong-making feature of doing that is in committing fraud against someone, not in stealing Coca-Cola's intellectual property, their right to that bottle design or whatever, right? But
yes, I can see the opposition to fraud. I don't consider that a form of intellectual property.
Yeah, exactly. But it seems like a possible problem that might emerge if we were to start having courts understand what we're doing when we're prohibiting that sort of fraud it risks reproducing a lot of the features that we find objectionable in intellectual property, right? Once we start establishing common law, constraints on what you can and can't do with making bottles shaped a certain way, you see how that's opening the door possibly to the same sorts of problems that we see with intellectual property under existing capitalism?
Theoretically, I don't know how much of a practical problem it's likely to actually become, because I think a lot of it would just come down to the facts of the case. Is the appearance of the bottle so closely in resemblance to someone else's product that a local jury could reasonably infer that it was a deliberate attempt to confuse their customers. And I think there would have to be some, civil standard, at least of a preponderance of the evidence, with the burden of proof on the plaintiff to show that there was actually some intent to deceive or confuse, or that the defendant was actually trying to present a public claim that it was the same.
I see.
Product.
So the idea is that in a civil case of this sort, the burden of proof would be on the claimant, whereas under intellectual property, as it's been captured, right, the burden of proof is always on the person who is being accused to prove that what they're doing is new, right? That seems like a pretty big protective mechanism, right?
Yeah, and I think just, it would be of limited applicability and just cases involving, specifically branding, which I don't even know, how big a phenomenon that would be in a stateless society. I think there's a good chance that a lot of things would just move away from branding altogether and towards Ralph Borzotti's idea of the commodity model instead, where there were just different standard grades of product,
much like we see with
you could also
with like coffee.
Like if you were a soap maker or a soft drink maker or whatever, I mean, you could make a product identical to someone else's just so long as you didn't put their maker's stamp on it. It would be that particular flavor of cola would be a commodity that different makers produced their own iteration of, and could sell just based on their maker's mark on the products. Somebody saying, well, I like Joe Blow's cola better than Jim Bob's cola, even though they might be indistinguishable in terms of ingredients and everything. It would be a particular grade of that commodity rather than a brand. But just leaving that aside, even if there is branding, I think it's of limited applicability. It's hard to see how that would be in any way applicable to a court proceeding over someone making an identical spare part to someone else's electronic device.
I guess the worry from someone who is skeptical to this sort of intellectual property is you're going to have, mechanisms of signaling, right, is what we're appealing to, which themselves can emerge independent of, state enforcement, quite clearly. The problem is that for those signals to be signals and not just noise, you need some sort of enforcement procedure on brands, right? And the worry is that once you have that enforcement procedure, even in like a polycentric legal context, that opens up the door for people to rent seek in a certain way that reproduces a lot of the problems that we have.
Yeah. I mean, there's always that danger, just a question of how far it's likely to go and how severe the damage would be compared to the cost of staving it off. And I think, in a case where a jury has to decide, between two rival cola makers in a community where one of them is saying, well, my product is just as good as that other guy's, or whether they're actually trying to confuse buyers of whether it's as to whether it's actually the same product or not. Even if that goes the wrong way, I think there's a limit to how much actual harm will result, and I seriously doubt the applicability of that to other, more materially significant things like patents on design for appliances and that sort of thing.
Let's go into another topic which you touch on that I understand you have some more forthcoming work on in the Methodenstreit piece, is the time preference case for returns to productive capital that Menger makes. Can you outline that and what you think went wrong with it?
Well, I think what went wrong with it is that time preference itself is a dependent variable, and I forget what the exact quote is or where it was. I don't have the document in front of me, but Brom Bawerk himself admitted that a person's time preference could vary just depending on their material situation and how long they could afford to wait for payment based on their existing reserves of wealth, so on. So basically, just like marginal productivity, time preference becomes a way of restating bargaining power.
Right. So once again, the marginalist impulse is to treat something as an exogenous variable that's just given, that is not open to critique, when it can be, in fact, open to critique for other institutional reasons.
Yeah.
And so, like, in your sort of vision of what a post-capitalist economy would look like, there probably would still be people earning risk and time preference premiums, right? You just...
I don't know about time preference premiums because the thing that I wrote on money in particular argued against the whole idea that investment was an advance of anything. I argued against what Schumpeter called advanced theories of capital investment, and in favor of what he called coordination theories, where the money or the capital itself is just an accounting device rather than something that has to have been saved up in the past and then advanced by someone. You don't have to have any past reserves to lend against at all.
And why wouldn't you need it? Sorry, it's been a while since I revisited that money piece.
Well, your money is actually just like a unit of account that is coordinating the movement of present goods. There's no reason different groups of producers can't constantly advance their chains of production to one another, just using a monetary unit to keep track of the balance without any of them starting out with any accumulated reserves of the monetary unit.
So this is where it seems like your allowance of the risk premium is still going to allow for a significant amount of sort of interest payments for deferred consumption, right? Because the idea is that where the lender is coming from, wherever the money is coming from that is being lended to start up a new venture, there is going to be some amount of risk that it won't be paid back, right? and it seems like someone is going to have some sort of compensation for that risk just in virtue of it being a deferred payment, right?
Well, I mean, you've got a larger system where it's not lending. If your account is credited for whatever food or whatever you advanced, that credited amount is in your account already in a mutual exchange system of the sort that Tom Greco described. The other person has a debit to their account.
I'm sorry, briefly, can you outline how that system works for our listeners?
Well, it's based on the same general idea David Graeber described in medieval villages, where there was no specie money in circulation, where everyone would just keep open running tabs with everyone else, so that everyone had a positive or negative balance at any given time. But it was just like bilateral balances between different individuals rather than an overall system. And Greco's system is more like one accounting system for an overall multi-member community, where each person has an account that looks similar to a checking account with a positive or negative balance based on the ratio of their goods and services that they have sold compared to those they've purchased. So you can start out with everybody having a zero balance and creating a debit, a negative balance when they buy something from someone else, and the other person has an equal positive balance. And the overall system has basic operating rules that define how much of a negative balance you're allowed to run. Greco just, gave one possible example, being that the negative balance you're allowed to run is defined by the typical volume of transactions in your account over a particular period of time, so that someone's negative balance might be limited to their average monthly volume of activity, or 6 months or whatever. But the point of the purpose of the money is not that it's not something that you save up and then lend to someone. It's just a device for tracking the movement.
But it seems like you're going to need some mechanism for ensuring that movement through time eventually clears and coordinates, right? And isn't that just going to look like an interest rate?
No. I mean, you just the mechanism is freezing someone's ability to make purchases once their negative balance reaches a certain level, until they've sold enough goods and services to bring it under the limit. But it's just a mechanism for tracking the ongoing movement of present goods and services back and forth.
Right, but once you have this system operating through time, with people presumably joining and leaving it at some point because they're going to have rights for exit and so on, aren't you just going to need some mechanism for ensuring that when people are leaving, they still have a zero balance? When they're joining, they still have or if they're leaving with a positive balance, they're taking the cash with them to a new system? Like, it seems like you're going to need some sort of mechanism for ensuring that people aren't leaving with negative balances, right?
Well, I think if they did leave with negative balances, the harm would be limited compared to the overall volume of the system. But really, I don't think a local system like that would be very useful if each one was just self-contained.
Yeah.
Like that, it would put a limit on the scale of coordination that could take place on the scale of economic enterprises. So there would have to be some larger scale of federation between such systems for transferring credit between local systems or tracking the movement of people from one system to another.
What you're describing is like what used to be under free banking systems an interbank clearinghouse, right?
Yeah, and you could have a larger scale system, like, for a big city where the major, say, worker-controlled factories in the local urban economy all were in charge of administering as a cooperative or federal system, the larger meta clearinghouse, and they could be, the ones making evaluations like okaying the size of the negative balance a new startup enterprise would be able to accrue just based on their majority of assessment of the community's ability to support an enterprise of that scale and so forth.
Well, why would
point they would have that startup capital?
Why would that larger system be making individual judgments on when a negative interest rate? Wouldn't it just be much easier with much fewer transaction costs to just have interest rates cleared between them? Like, what makes this system distinct from like the sort of free banking system envisioned by someone like George Selchin?
Well, there's no interest rates involved anywhere in it. It's just a question of the scale of the negative balance they're allowed to run while they're starting up. The amount of money they're allowed to money units they're allowed to outlay in startup funds, acquiring a building and machinery and raw materials and so forth before they have to start putting money back into it from sales. But there's no interest involved.
It just seems like in something like an interest rate is going to arise very quickly, though, because in order to tell how much the system as a whole, how much room the system as a whole has for lending out new amounts of money to a upstart entrepreneur is going to have to be dependent on something very, very similar to the, like, what we see as underwriting right now under loan systems. And in order for that to have like a function, you're going to need some sort of intertemporal pricing mechanism, right?
Well, it's not lending though, because the people who actually provide the enterprise with materials and machinery and so forth receive the payment in good current money. At the time they provide the material goods. It's just that the new enterprise acquires a negative balance equal to that same amount, and the larger all the enterprises participating in the larger federation are, before they decide to authorize that negative balance, are making the judgment of its likely success and the ability of the community to support it. But there's no point at which anyone is saying, well, we're allowing you to run this size of a negative balance, but you'll be required to pay in 20% more than that when you bring the balance back up or whatever.
The claim I'm making is that in order for them to be able to run that negative draw in order for the whole system to be able to support those negative balances based on their judgments, you're going to either need some sort of interest payment system in order to induce the repayment, or you're going to need such like a level of like detailed underwriting that you're reproducing a lot of the problems with legibility to bureaucracies that we have under current systems of underwriting, right? Because
the mechanism is just freezing the amount of just freezing their spending ability once they reach that permitted negative balance until they start selling some stuff again. But again, they're not cheating the people that they bought the materials and stuff from, because those people have already been paid in the exact same currency unit that everyone else uses, the same accounting unit. The only negative balance is within the account of the new enterprise itself, and that is limited in size relative to the system as a whole, so that if they go bankrupt or whatever, there's a limited negative effect at a systemic level.
It just seems like in order for the system to be able to make those judgments as to when it's okay to go negative and how much different individuals can go negative, it just seems like you're going to need, because for similar reasons to why you need the unit of account in the first place to make sense of static levels of balance and imbalance, you're going to need some sort of price mechanism for the whole system as a whole, and that's going to look very similar to an interest rate in a free banking loan context, right?
I don't see how anything like an interest rate needs to enter the picture. I think you just set the quantity of the permitted negative balance itself relative to the size of the system as a whole and the risk to it, and that is the negative balance they're permitted to run in setting up the new enterprise. And their calculation of the size of the balance takes into account the ability of the system as a whole to absorb it if they default. Everybody's already been. The thing is, everybody's already been paid either way.
Okay.
Nobody has actually advanced anything in the sense of lending something that they no longer have. They've already been paid. That's the big thing right there, is it just getting rid of the idea that capital investment is an advance against past savings. It's the money is not an accumulated good that's lent against. It's just a coordination of the current movement of goods and services.
Let's pivot a bit to discussions of the relationship between your work and like theoretical political economy and policy. So you sometimes defend state interventions into the market, or things that vulgar libertarians read as interventions, and really are to make up for these sorts of institutional level distortions of the state. I have in mind like some of your work defending the minimum wage. What are your thoughts on the relationship between defenses of those states' intervention and when it's not a good idea to defend those states' intervention?
Well, it's what it comes down to is the place I laid all this out most comprehensively was in the essay I submitted to an anthology on dialectical libertarianism that Chris Schiapara edited. where I wrote on real versus, or wrote on, substantive statism versus nominal statism. And I argued that a given state measure, that calls itself may be nominally statist in the sense that it's called a regulation, but if you look at it in dialectical or systemic terms of the functional role it plays within the larger existing system, it may be an increase in net statism, or it may actually be a decrease in net statism, just depending on how it affects the rest of what the state's doing. So if the state has already conferred enormous amounts of privilege on particular economic actors, and then the state turns around and passes a regulation on what they can do with that privilege, it's actually a reduction or qualification of its previous grant of privilege.
Right. So a lot of what is going to go on there then is all these very thorny empirical questions about the particular policy in question, right?
Yeah. It's obviously going to be a judgment call, but what isn't? If you oppose a particular measure, you're running the risk that it amounts in substantive terms to maintaining the status power of an existing privileged class. So, just in practical terms and for ethical reasons, I think you can't just blindly support the repeal of anything that's called a regulation without considering how that affects the existing power of privileged entities that are part of the statist system. The whole point is to reduce the overall coerciveness of the entire system, not just to randomly hack away at any of the branches, regardless of their structural role. You should be, first of all, you should be repealing the most fundamental forms of statism that prop up the privilege of the dominant actors in the system.
What do you think?
You should be doing that, you should be doing that instead of repealing the secondary measures that ameliorate those primary measures.
So let's get down to brass tacks. What are some of the things that you would take to be primary versus secondary ones?
Well, the primary interventions would be just those that are like foundational or architectonic to the system. The property rules that have ratified enclosure of land over previous centuries, the property rules that uphold absentee capitalist ownership of firms as it's developed over the previous centuries, based on the ability of privileged classes to provide the capital through not only the ill-gotten gains of land enclosure, but from economic rents of all kinds and state interference with the bargaining power of labor, and the minimum wage and things like, say, a card check unionism law would be secondary measures that reduce privileges of the landed and capitalist classes.
But But don't we need like a good way to tell which are good secondary measures and which are not? Right? Because it seems to me things like price controls, whether they be rent control or what have you, tend to have effects that further lock out would-be entrants to the market for housing or the market for labor in a way that makes it significantly harder for people who are currently existing on the fringes of that system to function. And
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of practical analysis required, and there are cases where arguably the remedy might not actually benefit the victims of past harm as much as is intended. And I think things like capping rent for the most part going to have unintended negative consequences. Although I think I've seen people claim there are analyses that show that hasn't happened in particular areas. I'm agnostic on the question of it, but I think in the case of housing prices and high rent, the answer would be a combination of things like land value taxation and support for community land trusts, along with all the YIMBY stuff on zoning reform and increasing density rather than freezing rents. Although in some cases, freezing rents is a temporary measure, might or might not be practically feasible.
so let's take another example of like an area where I'm more unsettled and not sure what to say, which is, the sort of things Liz Anderson is arguing about for reforming the amount of control that employers have over their employees, both in and out of work. Right?
Yeah.
These seem like cases where I really, really get the argument that it's a secondary intervention that can reduce the total amount of coercion given the way that state property norms and taxation norms have induced artificial economies of scale that skews in the direction of established consumers of labor, firms and employees and such. But it seems like if you're going to use the bureaucratic apparatus of the state to try to ameliorate that, you're risking needing to make more and more functions of employer-employee relations legible to that state bureaucracy in a way that induces all sorts of public choice problems that might allow for even more barriers to entry down the line. How do you think about that sort of trade-off?
Well, I when it comes to trade-offs like that, I'm definitely in favor of most general or comprehensive measures that can be carried out by just redefining general rules rather than through ongoing micro-regulation. I'd rather just see something like worker expropriation being tacitly allowed by the state or something like that, or large scale stuff like enterprise councils,
so
that sort of thing, or facilitating the formation of labor unions and then leaving it to them to handle the actual negotiating work rather than increasing the regulatory bureaucracy. But it's just, I guess it's a case-by-case issue. I generally, like Karl Korsch's idea of non-reformist reforms that push institutional structure in a direction that lays the foundation for downsizing the state rather than requiring an increased scale of of actual, just state activity and involvement of the state apparatus.
All right. And then the last question I always ask are, what are 3 books or articles of writing or interpretive dances or works of art or whatever that have been formative in you developing the views that we've discussed today?
I'm horrible at coming up with answers to this sort of thing just off the top of my head. I guess what really got me started along the general road towards decentralist economics and anarchism and all of that was a book by Kirkpatrick Sale called Human Scale. I think the first edition was written in like 1980 or something. And I didn't come across it until 1998. And I devoured the book, and then I just started digging through all of the endnotes for the sources he cited, especially on things like state subsidies and the economy of scale and all that, and followed them through just, footnote chain referencing from one source to its sources and so forth. And that led me to a lot of other stuff like, I think it was Walter Adams, Bigness Complex. The name was Adams anyway. And Barry Stein's book on community enterprise, and a lot of other stuff by Ralph Borsotti and books on lean production and so forth. Then the first big influence on my understanding of U.S. foreign policy and international economics and politics probably would have been Noam Chomsky. I read a lot of fictional works that really resonated with me, like Cory Doctorow's Walk Away, and a lot of near future novels by Kim Stanley Robinson and Daniel Suarez.
All right. Well, I think that was more than 3, so you fulfilled your quota.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on, Kevin.
Well, thanks a lot for inviting me. It was fun.